Tokyo, late autumn of 1944. Inside a dimly lit room at the Naval General Staff Headquarters, Commander Chikataka Nakajima leans over a thick folder marked Confidential, Combined Fleet Personnel Estimates. Rain lashes against the window. The air smells of ink and cigarette smoke. The war has turned silent for Japan, not for lack of fighting, but because the reports coming in from the Marianas, the Philippines, and the Pacific Rim all tell the same story: defeat. Nakajima turns the page. The number stares back at him. 2,034,343. That is the U.S. Navy's total enlisted strength, reported by intercepted intelligence summaries. His hand stops mid-air. Just 3 years earlier, Japan's most senior admirals had confidently predicted that America could field no more than 296,000 sailors in the Pacific. The Imperial Navy had planned its entire war on that estimate, and now the figure has multiplied by nearly sevenfold. Nakajima exhales slowly. He knows in that moment that the war is already lost, not because of the courage of American sailors, but because of mathematics. The truth had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, waiting to be seen. In the years leading up to the Pacific War, Japan's naval planners stood at the height of confidence. They had defeated Russia in 1905, a European empire brought to its knees by Japanese ships at Tsushima. They had taken German colonies in the Pacific during the First World War. Their naval academies were filled with the best minds of an empire convinced that discipline, precision, and spirit could overcome any opponent. But beneath that pride lay a dangerous illusion. Throughout the 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, operated on a deeply ingrained assumption that no industrial power, not even the United States, could mobilize a truly massive military force across the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. Their war games, operational planning documents, and staff briefings all revolved around a belief in quality over quantity. In naval exercises, a Japanese Zero or a skilled destroyer crew could destroy multiple enemy aircraft or ships before being overwhelmed. Every analysis emphasized tactical brilliance, elite training, and honor-bound courage, attributes that, while admirable, could not replace the raw arithmetic of manpower and industrial capacity. At the Naval Staff College in Tokyo, officers routinely estimated that if war broke out with America, the United States could field a fleet comparable to Japan's in numbers, but not in reach. They assumed that distance, logistics, and public opinion would limit American involvement to a few decisive battles. Their intelligence section, Tokomubu, even quantified America's potential naval manpower: 296,000 sailors. That number would shape every major strategic document between 1940 and 1941. To Japanese officers, it sounded realistic. The U.S. Navy had roughly 337,000 personnel in late 1941, but the figure was not widely known in Tokyo. Even if it had been, few would have believed that the United States could expand tenfold within 4 years. They saw America as a democracy constrained by politics, individualism, and economic fatigue from the Great Depression. A nation wealthy, yes, but soft. They underestimated the force of an industrial democracy at war. Inside Japan's war planning circles, these assumptions crystallized into doctrine. The entire imperial strategy, from the Pearl Harbor attack plan to the expected timetable of American counteroffensives, was built upon the premise that America's strength was finite and predictable. The Japanese Navy envisioned a short, high-intensity war, a lightning offensive across the Pacific, the capture of resource-rich territories, and the establishment of an impregnable defensive perimeter. Then, the United States, faced with long supply lines, mounting casualties, and dwindling will, would negotiate peace. That was the plan, and it might have worked if the premise had been true. But in truth, by late 1941, America had already activated its industrial and manpower mobilization programs. Factories in Detroit, Seattle, and California were being retooled to build aircraft, ships, and weapons at an unprecedented pace. Civilian shipyards were training thousands of new workers every month. Naval recruitment centers were filling up faster than they could process enlistments. By the time the first Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the United States had already begun the greatest military expansion in human history. But Tokyo didn't know or refused to see. The intelligence system that should have warned them was fatally flawed. Reports from Japanese embassies in Washington and Honolulu mentioned increased shipbuilding and mobilization. But those warnings were buried beneath layers of optimism and bureaucracy. Naval intelligence officers who tried to revise manpower estimates were quietly sidelined. The truth that America could mobilize millions was considered defeatist talk. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, though one of Japan's few realists, struggled against this mindset. He had studied in the United States, understood its industrial potential, and warned colleagues that fighting such a nation would mean sleeping next to a volcano. But even Yamamoto underestimated the scale. He believed America could eventually deploy perhaps 1 million men to the Pacific, a terrifying number at the time, but still less than half of what would actually come. Japan's leadership didn't just miscalculate America's numbers, they misunderstood its system. They saw a nation that debated endlessly, that tolerated criticism, that seemed indecisive. They mistook this for weakness. They couldn't see that this same openness was the source of America's adaptability, its ability to learn, mobilize, and correct mistakes faster than any authoritarian regime could. As 1941 turned into 1942, Japan's tactical victories from Pearl Harbor to Singapore fed the illusion that the strategy was working. But behind every American ship sunk, there were already 10 being built. Behind every pilot lost, another was training in the skies above California or Florida. And for every Japanese victory, the unseen counterweight of American manpower grew heavier, silently waiting to crush them. By mid-1942, the signs were already there. The Battle of Midway exposed cracks in Japan's intelligence and production assumptions. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, gone in one day. Japan could not replace them. America, by contrast, commissioned 10 new carriers within the next 12 months. But even after that staggering reversal, Japanese analysts insisted that the enemy's manpower could not be sustained indefinitely. They were wrong, fatally wrong. By 1943, the Pacific was no longer an ocean of opportunity for Japan. It had become a vast closing trap. The war that Tokyo believed would last months had stretched into years, and the foundation of its confidence, the assumption of American limitation, was crumbling. Japan's naval command began receiving intelligence reports that seemed impossible to reconcile with their earlier estimates. U.S. shipyards were launching new vessels at a rate no one in Tokyo could comprehend. Between 1942 and 1943 alone, the United States commissioned over 1,000 new ships, including 32 aircraft carriers, 349 destroyers, and 203 submarines. Japan, by comparison, could barely keep pace with repair work. At Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, senior officers reviewed photographs smuggled from American newspapers and reconnaissance flights over Pearl Harbor, and what they saw was deeply unsettling. Dry docks once thought idle were now crowded with hulls under construction. New training centers appeared across the American West Coast. The sheer number of sailors drilling, marching, and loading equipment into convoys defied logic. By the end of 1943, the Imperial Navy's Intelligence Division estimated that U.S. naval personnel had likely reached 700,000. But even that revised figure was disastrously wrong. The true number, based on declassified post-war U.S. Navy records, had already exceeded 1.7 million. And it wasn't just quantity. America's manpower expansion was synchronized with industrial genius. Henry J. Kaiser's shipyards were producing a Liberty ship every 3.5 days. Naval aviators were being trained at Pensacola, Corpus Christi, and Glenview in numbers so large that instructors joked the Pacific would run out of ocean before America ran out of pilots. The massive naval training station at Great Lakes, Illinois, processed 70,000 recruits every 6 weeks. Each class graduated with identical precision, discipline, and technical skill, a human assembly line of war readiness. Meanwhile, Japan's own system was collapsing under the weight of its ambitions. Fuel shortages grounded training squadrons. Aircraft production suffered from a lack of aluminum and skilled labor. The once elite naval aviators who had terrorized the Pacific in 1941 were being replaced by hastily trained pilots with only 100 flying hours, less than 1/3 of their American counterparts. Worse still, Japan's logistical system, the invisible lifeline of any war machine, was nearing collapse. American submarines prowled Japan's sea lanes like wolves, cutting off vital resources from the Dutch East Indies and Malaya. Oil tankers were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. Every gallon of fuel spent in training or transport became a strategic decision. And yet, inside Tokyo's Naval General Staff, a strange cognitive dissonance persisted. The intelligence summaries that crossed the desks of admirals were diluted, euphemized, or selectively edited. The truth that Japan was losing not just ships, but the capacity to wage modern war was too politically dangerous to acknowledge. Admiral Osami Nagano, then chief of the Naval General Staff, once told a subordinate, "We must fight as if we can still win, for the Emperor's faith demands it." The tragedy was that Japan's leaders were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting to preserve the illusion of it. In contrast, the United States approached war as an equation, not an emotion. American planners at the Bureau of Ships and the Office of Naval Personnel calculated every variable. How many sailors could be trained per month? How many replacements could be produced per casualty? How many gallons of fuel per sortie? By late 1943, the U.S. Navy had established 14 major training commands across the country, connected to 35 specialized technical schools, a logistical organism of staggering efficiency. This system was self-sustaining. If a ship was lost, another was already being built. If a pilot was killed, 2 were waiting in line to take his place. Every loss was accounted for, every replacement already scheduled before the casualty list was even finalized. Japan, on the other hand, was bleeding irreplaceable human capital. Its best engineers, its finest aviators, its most experienced officers, all gone, one by one, faster than they could be replaced. Every battle victory carried a hidden defeat, the loss of a generation that could never be rebuilt. By the time Admiral Raymond Spruance led the U.S. Fifth Fleet into the Marianas in mid-1944, the imbalance had become absolute. The Japanese fleet that faced him was still proud, still deadly, but hollow. Most of its air wings were filled with undertrained pilots, flying obsolete aircraft, directed by intelligence that still believed the United States had fewer than 1 million sailors. In reality, by that very summer, America's Pacific Fleet alone operated with over 2 million men under naval command. The moment of realization, the instant Japan finally saw the full scale of its miscalculation, was approaching like a thunderclap. It would come not in a meeting room, not in a briefing paper, but in the sky over the Philippine Sea. A battle so one-sided it would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. And in that moment, every false assumption, every ignored report, every arrogant dismissal of American capacity would come crashing down in a storm of fire and shattered steel. In the shadows of Tokyo's Naval General Staff Building, amid cigarette smoke and the rhythmic scratching of pens, a small group of officers carried the weight of a nation's understanding of its enemy. They were Japan's naval intelligence officers, men like Commander Chikataka Nakajima, who analyzed intercepted reports, economic data, and American industrial figures. They worked tirelessly, but in a system that rewarded obedience more than accuracy. Intelligence work in Imperial Japan was a career cul-de-sac. Prestige lay in command at sea, not behind a desk. Officers who specialized in intelligence rarely rose to the rank of admiral. Their warnings, when they contradicted operational plans, were seen as obstacles rather than insights. Nakajima himself would later tell American interrogators after the war, "We did not lack information. We lacked the permission to believe it." That statement captured the essence of Japan's blindness. Data existed, census figures, shipping manifests, U.S. production reports published in civilian journals. Even before Pearl Harbor, the United States Census Bureau openly documented industrial output that dwarfed Japan's total manufacturing capacity. But acknowledging that data would have meant questioning the feasibility of war, an unthinkable act within a military culture built on loyalty and faith in victory. As the war dragged on, the emotional cost of that denial grew unbearable. Families in Japan were told that every setback was temporary, every loss glorious. Young officers trained in Bushido ideals clung to the belief that courage could compensate for numbers. But by 1944, as casualty lists lengthened and letters stopped coming home, even the most devoted began to see the cracks. Inside intelligence rooms, officers whispered doubts to each other, but never aloud to their superiors. To question the feasibility of victory was to invite suspicion of defeatism, a crime that could end a career, or worse. And so the human heart of the intelligence failure was not ignorance, it was fear. Fear of telling the truth in a system that could not bear to hear it. The Pacific War was not merely a clash of fleets. It was a contest of systems. In this arena, numbers were not abstract, they were weapons. The Americans understood this early. In 1942, as Japan pushed deep into the Pacific, the U.S. Navy quietly built the Fleet Replacement and Training Command, an institution designed to keep ships fully manned and operational indefinitely. Every sailor lost could be replaced within weeks. Every aircrew casualty was logged, analyzed, and compensated by accelerated training cycles. This tactical flexibility transformed the very nature of naval warfare. At the Battle of Midway, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers and over 100 experienced pilots, a blow it would never recover from. The Americans, however, rebuilt their carrier force to full strength in less than 6 months. By 1944, the United States was fielding a dozen fleet carriers simultaneously, an impossible figure by Japanese standards. The tactical ripple effects were immense. Japan's doctrine depended on decisive battle, one grand confrontation that would cripple the enemy. America's doctrine evolved into continuous engagement, an endless rhythm of attack, repair, and redeployment. In such a war, attrition became strategy. When the Battle of the Philippine Sea began in June 1944, Japan entered the fight with 450 aircraft. By the end of 2 days, nearly all were destroyed, along with their pilots. The Americans lost just 29 planes, many of which were already replaced before the battle even ended. Tactically, it was annihilation. Strategically, it was revelation. This was what industrialized warfare looked like when fueled by unlimited manpower. The Imperial Japanese Navy's engineers were brilliant. They built fast, long-range ships like the Yamato and Musashi, designed with armor thicker than any contemporary vessel. But brilliance was useless when trapped within scarcity. Every Yamato-class battleship consumed resources equivalent to 12 U.S. Essex-class carriers, ships that could project power across oceans, not just survive in them. American industry became the ultimate weapon. Factories in California, Michigan, and Pennsylvania churned out radar systems, aviation fuel, engines, and naval guns faster than Japan could even request replacements. At its peak, the U.S. Navy was launching one ship every day, while Japanese shipyards could complete only a handful per month. This industrial disparity wasn't just about machines. It was about infrastructure intelligence, knowing how to mobilize an entire society for war. The Americans mastered it through the coordination of civilian and military sectors under centralized planning. Japan, still rooted in feudal hierarchies and inter-service rivalry, could never achieve the same. Tokyo's intelligence services had access to open-source American economic data, yet they failed to translate numbers into meaning. They saw steel tonnage, but didn't grasp production elasticity. They noted aircraft output, but ignored training scalability. The U.S. could double production in a year because it had millions of trained workers and automated assembly systems, a reality Japan never truly understood. The ultimate cause of Japan's intelligence collapse was not technical or tactical. It was cultural and hierarchical. Leaders like Admiral Shigetaro Shimada and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto operated under immense political pressure. They knew that Japan could not win a long war, but saying so publicly was unthinkable. Yamamoto's own words before Pearl Harbor were prophetic. "In the first 6 months, I will run wild. After that, I make no promises." He was right. By 1943, Japan's ability to sustain war was eroding. Yet Admiral Shimada and others continued to base strategy on outdated intelligence, not because they were blind, but because the system demanded certainty, not truth. Meetings at the Naval General Staff were not debates, but rituals. Plans were approved, not for feasibility, but for honor. When intelligence officers presented data contradicting victory forecasts, they were told, "The spirit of the Japanese sailor will compensate." That faith in spirit, over logistics, over numbers, over reality, became Japan's undoing. By 1944, Japan's navy was not just outnumbered, it was outfought, outproduced, and outled by a nation that viewed war as arithmetic, not mysticism. And that leadership blindness, built on layers of pride and cultural rigidity, ensured that when the truth finally arrived, the truth of 2,034,343 American sailors, it would land like a hammer blow against everything the empire believed about itself. At the heart of Japan's wartime miscalculation lay one of the most paradoxical truths in military history. Japan had intelligence, but not insight. The Japanese Navy's intelligence network, known as the Naval General Staff's Second Bureau, gathered immense amounts of data through diplomatic channels, commercial monitoring, and espionage. Tokyo was not blind to America's numbers. They knew about shipyard capacities, oil reserves, and industrial mobilization. They intercepted American communications. They even studied publications like Jane's Fighting Ships and the New York Times, which openly discussed U.S. military buildup. So why did they believe that America could only field 296,000 sailors when the reality was more than 2 million? Because the Japanese intelligence system filtered truth through ideology. Analysts could collect facts, but interpretation was the privilege of the high command. Reports were rewritten to align with expectations, a process known internally as chosei, adjustment. If raw data suggested that the U.S. Navy was producing too many ships to counter, the figures were adjusted to maintain strategic optimism. American signals were also misread through a lens of cultural misunderstanding. When Japan intercepted the term Task Force 58, they assumed it meant a temporary fleet, not realizing it was one of the largest and most permanent naval strike groups in history. Even as dozens of carriers appeared in the Pacific, Japanese officers believed these ships rotated crews between a few hulls, not understanding that the Americans were producing new carriers faster than Japan could sink them. This failure was not simply technical, it was psychological. It reflected a deep-seated inability to imagine an enemy whose capacity for adaptation was limitless. Intelligence became not a tool of clarity, but a mirror reflecting national pride. By the time the U.S. Navy reached its wartime peak in 1945, with 2,034,343 sailors, 6,700 ships, and over 90,000 aircraft, Japan's intelligence apparatus had already ceased to function as an instrument of reality. It existed to affirm belief, not to confront truth. Long before the war began, Japan's military had crafted a national myth that spirit outweighed material. This belief, rooted in the Bushido Code and centuries of isolationist pride, became the philosophical armor of an empire preparing to face industrial giants. In Japanese military academies, cadets were taught that Western nations were morally weak, dependent on machines, comfort, and consumerism. Japanese strength, they believed, lay in purity of purpose and willingness to sacrifice. The slogan, Seishin wa Butsuri ni Masaru, spirit surpasses matter, was not propaganda, it was doctrine. This ideology infected intelligence assessments as well. Every report comparing U.S. and Japanese shipbuilding rates, oil reserves, or manpower was read through the lens of this cultural superiority. Where logic said impossible, faith said inevitable. By the early 1940s, Japan's military elite had constructed an echo chamber of invincibility. Newspapers published inflated kill ratios. Radio broadcasts claimed U.S. fleets were shattered, even after Midway. And when soldiers returned from losing campaigns in the Solomon Islands or New Guinea, their reports were quietly buried to preserve morale. This cultural arrogance blinded Japan to industrial reality. In 1943, while American shipyards launched 1,500 new vessels, Japan launched barely 90. Yet newspapers in Tokyo declared that American power is finite. Japanese spirit is eternal. The deeper tragedy was that this illusion reached all levels of society. Children were taught in schools that Japan's divine destiny guaranteed victory. Mothers sent their sons to war believing they were invincible. And by the time truth emerged, when Tokyo was in flames and the emperor spoke on radio, the shock was not just military. It was existential. The nation that believed itself chosen by heaven had to confront that even divine spirit could not defeat arithmetic. When the war finally ended in August 1945 and Allied occupation began, the surviving members of Japan's military command were forced to face what they had long suppressed. American interrogators, led by naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison and others, presented them with data, tonnage charts, recruitment figures, production graphs. When they saw the real numbers, silence filled the room. Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa reportedly murmured, "We never imagined such figures. We fought ghosts of our own making." This moment, the realization of how wrong they had been, was not just a statistical correction, it was a moral reckoning. For years, Japan's leaders had sent millions of men into battle under false assumptions. They had justified sacrifice with illusions. They had told families that faith would triumph over industry, courage over factories, spirit over machines. The truth: 34,343 American sailors, hundreds of thousands of planes, and a production system that never slept, revealed the cost of that delusion. Every kamikaze pilot who believed he could turn the tide with a single strike was in part a victim of this systemic lie. Every soldier stranded on a Pacific island was abandoned by leadership that preferred myth to mathematics. The moral dimension of Japan's miscalculation extends far beyond strategy. It asks the haunting question: what happens when belief becomes stronger than truth? For Japan, the answer was Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the smoldering ruins of Tokyo. The physical manifestation of a nation forced to confront its own blindness. And yet, even in defeat, that reckoning became a seed of transformation. The same Japan that once ignored data would, in the post-war era, rebuild itself through precision, calculation, and realism. The lesson of those miscounted sailors, from 296,000 to 2,034,343, became a silent foundation for Japan's modern discipline of efficiency and technological mastery. The war had shown that power wasn't in steel or blood alone, it was in truth. And the truth Japan had refused to see now stood undeniable, cast in iron, numbers, and memory. By mid-1944, the Pacific was no longer a contest of fleets. It was a demonstration of industrial dominance. The Americans had turned the ocean itself into a conveyor belt of war. Ships left San Francisco, Seattle, and Pearl Harbor in endless streams. Carriers, destroyers, supply ships, floating dry docks, even mobile hospitals, all synchronized by logistics networks so vast that Japanese intelligence officers simply refused to believe the reports. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 1944, marked the exact moment the illusion died. Japan entered the fight with what it called the Great A-Go Plan, hoping to inflict a decisive blow on the U.S. fleet near the Marianas. They launched over 400 carrier-borne aircraft, led by veteran pilots of the Imperial Navy's proudest squadrons. What returned was devastation. In 2 days of combat, American fighter pilots destroyed nearly 450 Japanese aircraft. So many that U.S. aviators mockingly called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost 3 aircraft carriers, hundreds of planes, and irreplaceable crews. The Americans lost 29 aircraft. Their flight decks were operational again within hours. For the first time, Japan's naval staff understood what they were truly facing: an enemy that could take losses, replace them overnight, and return stronger. It was the living manifestation of what intelligence officers like Commander Chikataka Nakajima had warned years earlier: America fights, not with one army, but with many layers of armies behind it, each ready before the first one falls. Back in Tokyo, the war reports grew surreal. Radio Tokyo claimed brilliant victory, while intelligence intercepts showed U.S. fleets already pushing toward Guam and Saipan. When Admiral Soemu Toyota, chief of the Naval General Staff, received the true casualty reports, he was said to have stared at the figures for several minutes before whispering, "This is no longer a war of men. It is a war of numbers, and we have lost that war." After the Philippine Sea, the collapse accelerated. Japan's industrial base was crippled by Allied submarines, cutting off oil and steel imports. By late 1944, the empire's merchant fleet was reduced by 2/3. Factories had electricity only a few hours a day. Aircraft production fell by half within months. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, America reached full war rhythm. In a single year, 1944, U.S. shipyards launched 18 fleet carriers, 33 escort carriers, 349 destroyers, and over 3,000 landing craft. Every week saw a new task force sailing west, larger than the one before. By December, Admiral Nimitz could deploy more carriers than the Japanese Navy had planes left to fly. Japan's intelligence officers documented this with growing despair. Nakajima's late 1943 reassessment, suppressed by superiors, had already predicted Japan's defeat by 1945 if the trend continued. Now, that prediction had become undeniable. American carrier groups blanketed the Pacific, each accompanied by dozens of support ships. Every U.S. loss, a ship sunk, a plane destroyed, was replaced twofold within weeks. Japanese pilots, once elite, were now hastily trained teenagers with barely 100 hours of flight time, facing Americans with 10 times that experience and modern radar-guided weapons. By the time of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, Japan threw everything it had left into a desperate gamble to repel the American invasion of the Philippines. 4 days later, Japan's combined fleet ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Admiral Kurita's center force retreated under overwhelming air attack. 4 more carriers were sunk, dozens of destroyers destroyed. Even suicide tactics, the first organized kamikaze missions, could not change the outcome. The Imperial Navy had been annihilated not by bravery or cowardice, but by math. For every plane Japan built, America built 12. For every sailor Japan trained, America trained 10. For every ton of oil Japan could import, America refined 50. The difference was absolute. It wasn't merely an advantage, it was another dimension of warfare. By early 1945, Tokyo was in ruins. Firebombing raids had reduced entire districts to ash. Japan's surviving admirals and generals met in bunkers beneath the city, surrounded by walls lined with outdated charts. The reports arriving from the front were no longer deniable. America's Pacific Fleet now contained more sailors than the entire population of Nagasaki Prefecture. The intelligence briefings, once padded with euphemisms like temporary disadvantage, became brutally honest. One surviving document, dated February 1945, reads, "Total American naval personnel now exceeds 2 million. Our maximum replacement capacity for trained sailors stands at 5,000 per month. Current operational tempo is unsustainable beyond 6 months." In the margin, an officer scribbled the words, "We are out of time." This was not defeat by battle, it was defeat by realization. The truth Japan had buried beneath pride and propaganda had clawed its way to the surface. The system that once silenced uncomfortable intelligence now had nothing left to silence. When Admiral Shigetaro Shimada, the Navy minister, was later interrogated by American officers after the surrender, he was asked why Japan had ignored its own intelligence about America's manpower. His reply was chilling, because if we had accepted it, we would have had to admit that the war was lost before it began. That single sentence, calm, resigned, is the epitaph of the entire Imperial Japanese Navy. 11. The numbers that ended an empire. In the end, the war's story could be written not in battles, but in ratios. Category: Japan, peak; United States, peak; ratio: US-Japan. Naval personnel: 2,034,343, 7-1. Aircraft carriers: 25, 122, 5-1. Total aircraft: 15,000, 300,000 plus, 20-1. Annual ship output: 1944, 90, 1,500 plus, 17-1. Oil supply barrels year: 20 million, 250 million, 12-1. These numbers, cold and unfeeling, reveal the real battlefield, the factories, the shipyards, the training academies. While Japan fought with courage, America fought with capacity. Every sailor in the Pacific was not just a fighter. He was a manifestation of an industrial civilization that had turned science, labor, and willpower into weapons. The Pacific War wasn't won in Midway or Leyte. It was won in Detroit, Pittsburgh, San Francisco, and Pearl Harbor, in the assembly lines that ran day and night, powered by a workforce of millions who never saw the front. And that is the final truth the Japanese High Command never grasped. Wars of industry are not won by courage alone. They are won by systems that can endure loss, adapt, and rebuild faster than their enemies can destroy. By mid-1945, the Pacific had become an American ocean. Japanese convoys no longer sailed openly. They crept along coastlines by night, fearful of submarines that prowled like silent predators. The once proud combined fleet, the heart of Imperial Japan's naval power, was reduced to fragments. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, sat idle in Kure Harbor, a symbol of pride that had nowhere left to go and no fuel left to sail. In April 1945, the Japanese High Command made one last attempt to show defiance. The Yamato would sail on a one-way mission, Operation Tengo, to beach herself on Okinawa, serve as an unsinkable fortress. The ship carried enough fuel for only a single trip. When U.S. reconnaissance detected her departure, 350 American aircraft swarmed in. Within 2 hours, the Yamato was torn apart by bombs and torpedoes. She exploded in a column of flame so vast that it was seen from over 100 miles away. Of her 3,300-man crew, fewer than 300 survived. For Japan, it was more than the loss of a ship. It was the death of an idea. The idea that courage could defeat capacity, that devotion could overcome industry, that a warrior's spirit could compensate for the absence of resources. That myth drowned with the Yamato. Back in Tokyo, even the most loyal admirals began to acknowledge what they had long suspected. Commander Nakajima, by now working under the Naval Intelligence Bureau, compiled one final report. It was brief, only 5 pages, but devastating in its implications. We have lost the ability to replace men. We have lost the ability to replace ships. We have lost the ability to replace hope. It was never formally submitted. The war ended before it reached anyone who could act on it. When Japan's surrender became inevitable, surviving officers were ordered to destroy sensitive documents. Thousands of pages of intelligence estimates, internal assessments, and intercepted communications were burned. But among the files recovered by American investigators after the occupation, one folder survived. It contained Japan's pre-war estimate of U.S. naval personnel, 296,000 sailors projected by 1943. Below it, handwritten in red pencil sometime in late 1944, someone had added the actual figure, 2,034,343. Underneath a single line, "We never truly saw our enemy." That note, anonymous, untraceable, speaks louder than any after-action report. It represents the tragedy of a nation blinded by its own assumptions. Japan did not lose the Pacific War because it fought poorly. It lost because it misunderstood the scale of reality. Its admirals had studied Mahan and Nelson, the art of decisive battle and tactical brilliance. They had not studied Ford's assembly lines or U.S. Census data. They fought as though wars were still won by ships and shells, not by spreadsheets, logistics chains, and manpower reserves. To the men in Japan's Naval General Staff, America was still an island fortress, rich, industrial, but distant and disorganized. They could not imagine that the same nation that once fielded isolationist rhetoric in the 1930s could transform itself into the greatest mobilization machine in human history. When the truth arrived, in the form of 2 million sailors, 3,000 ships, and thousands of aircraft, it was too late. By August 1945, the Pacific was no longer contested. American carriers sailed off the Japanese coast unopposed. The same waters where Japan once dreamed of expansion now carried the instruments of its destruction. Japan's naval airfield stood silent. Its once proud destroyers were scuttled or trapped in shallow harbors. Fuel reserves had fallen below the level needed even for training missions. Then came the final act, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not as battles, but as grim punctuation marks on a war that had already been mathematically decided. By the time the atomic bombs fell, Japan's capacity to resist had long vanished. The explosions simply forced the inevitable acknowledgement of what had been true for months. Japan was fighting a war it could no longer physically sustain. At surrender, Japan's total naval personnel stood near 300,000, the same figure it had predicted for the Americans in 1943. The irony was almost cruel. The number that Japan believed would define America's limits turned out to define its own. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, America's naval rolls exceeded 2 million active sailors, an empire of manpower that could project power across oceans, maintain fleets in every hemisphere, and still expand. Production at home. Numbers don't feel emotion. They don't know pride or courage or fear. But in this war, they decided everything. And they became the quiet, merciless executioners of the Japanese dream of empire. In the aftermath, surviving Japanese officers faced interrogation by Allied intelligence teams. Men like Nakajima and Shimada were asked not about tactics or weapons, but about assumptions. How had the Japanese high command so badly underestimated its opponent? Why had no one corrected the error? Nakajima's answer was as revealing as it was tragic. "We believed that if our men fought harder, we could overcome anything. We were wrong. The Americans could fight, lose, replace, and fight again, forever." He spoke without bitterness, only exhaustion. For him, the war's true lesson was not about aircraft or admirals, but about information, how nations see their enemies, and how they blind themselves with pride. Admiral Shimada, imprisoned for life but later released in 1955, never publicly acknowledged the intelligence failures. He spoke of honor and sacrifice, of courage against impossible odds. But to historians, those words echo hollow. The truth was not about honor. It was about hubris, the refusal to see what the numbers had been screaming all along. The Pacific War was fought with ships and shells, but it was decided by arithmetic. Every battle, from Pearl Harbor to Midway, from the Philippine Sea to Okinawa, was a line in an equation whose outcome had already been written. 296,000 estimated. 2,034,343 actual. That eightfold miscalculation was not just a number. It was a window into Japan's strategic blindness. It revealed a nation that measured its enemy by its own standards, and in doing so, doomed itself to fight a war it could not win. The Americans didn't just outbuild Japan, they outthought the concept of war itself. They turned production into strategy, logistics into power projection, and manpower into an inexhaustible tide. Against that, no amount of valor could prevail. When Japan finally surrendered aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the ceremony lasted just 23 minutes. But behind those 23 minutes were 4 years of attrition, 4 million tons of steel, and 2 million sailors who had crossed an ocean to end an empire. And in the silence that followed, Japan finally faced the truth it had denied from the beginning. The war had been lost not in 1945, but in 1941. The moment it chose to fight an enemy it did not truly understand. If you've stayed with us this far, you understand what this story truly means. It isn't just about numbers. It's about the limits of human belief and how nations can lose, not on the battlefield, but in the mind, long before the first shot is fired. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes for those who stop listening. That's why preserving these stories matters. Every decision, every miscalculation, every name on a forgotten report shaped the world we live in today. If this story gave you a deeper understanding of World War II, then take a second to subscribe, not for algorithms, but to stand with those who value truth over spectacle. Join a community of thinkers, veterans, and historians who refuse to let history fade into noise. Your next step is just ahead. Click the video on your screen. Explore the unseen intelligence war that shaped the Pacific, or dive into the rise and fall of the Yamato, Japan's ultimate battleship, because every episode connects to the next piece of the larger puzzle, the war that changed everything. Subscribe, watch the next story, and help us keep history alive and unflinching.